Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to another George Consortium COVID Law briefing. We're here today, again, in collaboration with Public Health Law Watch from Northeastern University, the Center for Public Health Law Research at Temple University, and our colleagues around the country who are thinking about issues related to the COVID-19 outbreak and law and policy. I'm Lance Gable. I'm an associate professor at Wayne State University Law School, and it's my great pleasure today to welcome our guest, Steph, who's a professor of law at the University of Wisconsin Law School. Our topic today is going to be food systems. Obviously, food systems are a core, fundamental system within our society that underlies a lot of our essential needs. Having access to food, making sure that food is being produced and distributed in an accessible way, are always important issues, even in normal times. And so during the COVID-19 outbreak, we've seen challenges to that system and lots of legal and policy issues arising. And so today, we're hoping to talk about some of those issues and delve into some of the things that we can do going forward to make sure that our food system remains stable and people have access to the food that they need. And so I'm really glad to have Steph here with us talking about this. I wanted to, oh, by the way, if you're watching this live on Twitter, we are able to answer questions, and so tweet your questions to hashtag COVID Law Briefing, and we'll try to answer them during the course of our discussion today. So I want to start with a really broad question, and that is, how does our food system work? How does the structure of the food system how is that system possibly challenged and vulnerable during an outbreak like our COVID-19 pandemic that we're experiencing right now?
Thanks for asking that question, Lance. So it's complicated. It's a complicated question to answer because there are many aspects of the food system. Like if you think of sort of a local supply food system, like a direct sale from a farm to a farmer's market, that's a fairly short, chain in the food system. Farmer brings stuff to a farmer's market, consumers go and they pick stuff up. Very direct link. But most of the food we get is not part of that small chain system. In fact, it's a very large chain system. You've got farms, but even before that, you've got the seed producers, which are often separate entities. They're selling things to the farmers. They're also getting other agrochemical supplies, including things like, fertilizers, pesticides, etc. That's coming from another link. And then they're going through, and they're usually shipping it to sort of cooperatives or some kind of consolidator to consolidate all the stuff that's growing on the farm. Or if you're thinking about meat, same thing there. Then that tends to go, and that also involves transportation chains too, because the shipment of that is fairly heavily regulated by the government in terms of food safety. That in turn, in the sort of consolidators, you have to move it to the processors, right? And that's another level, right? That's another link in the chain in the food system where, again, there's some transporters involved, there's safety issues involved, and then you've got the food processors in there. Sometimes there's additional elements because the processors are usually obtaining things from a lot of different sources. If you're thinking about, say, making a cake mix or something, right? You're getting stuff from around the world in terms of spices and things like that. So there's many, many links in the chain. And then there's the sales part of it, where you send the sort of things that are being processed to the retailers or to the restaurants. And so that's yet another layer of the sort of food system in which there's both links involved and then there's workers involved. Now, the thing that makes this especially complicated during the pandemic is that these systems have generally been structured to be as quote-unquote economically efficient as possible. And what that means is they're so tightly structured that the timing issues are very they're very pinpointed, right? There's, in terms of the transportation that I talked about, right? There's timing in terms of seasonality of harvest, transporting to the sort of consolidators, transporting to the processors, and that means that whenever anything's interrupted, it interrupts the entire chain. And that's where you're seeing all of these supply kind of issues in sort of, say, supermarkets hit, right? Because we've planned out this supply chain so that it's so tightly wound up together.
Yeah, now, you mentioned the fact that these supply chains can be quite long and that some of them are even incorporating ingredients that are from many parts of the world. And one of the things that we've obviously seen during the course of the pandemic is restrictions on traveling between countries, and even restrictions on traveling within the United States. And I'm wondering to what extent those travel restrictions or restrictions possibly on trade have affected the functioning of the system during the last couple of months.
Yeah, that's a really good question. By the way, I have some slides that I think we're going to share via Twitter. We haven't, due to the way that we've got this recording set up, there's no way to share them now. But if I were to answer this and I could show you this slide, I have a slide on just, how many different elements there are to make just tuna fish, right? You think of canned tuna as like something that's fairly simple, but it actually involves a lot of elements, including shipping the elements available to make the actual cans, actually doing the processing and all of that. And that's actually an international supply chain, even though it doesn't sound international. What does that mean when you have some kind of interruption in terms of international shipments and stuff like that? It means that although you might be able to get, say, the tuna, you might not be able to get the materials to make the actual canned supplies. And that can play out in a lot of different ways. Now, I haven't seen much in terms of travel restriction affecting something, say, like canned tuna. But I have seen travel restrictions affect guest workers, right? And so that's another, again, I mentioned earlier in describing the supply chain that there's many links in the chain, and there's also many workers in every single aspect of the links. And in terms of farms, the main thing that we rely upon are the guest worker visa workers, which are the H-2A workers. There's a lot of complexities in terms of that, because it turns out because of restrictions in worker entry, that means that many farms right now are facing shortages in workers, right, in terms of being able to harvest their crops, plant the crops, all of that stuff. And so that's one of the difficulties the pandemic raises.
Yeah, and I know that there's a lot of talk a few weeks ago in discussions about additional immigration restrictions. There's a lot of emphasis put on the fact that essential workers would still be allowed to cross national borders to continue to work in the United States from Canada and Mexico, although a lot of the focus focused more on the healthcare side of things rather than on the food supply side of things. And so I wonder, as this situation develops over the next ensuing months, whether there'll be more attention paid to the food supply side and the worker needs of the different industries that are producing our food. So another area that's been getting a lot of media attention recently, and you mentioned briefly before, is the meat processing industry. And in particular, a lot of the attention comes from the fact that there's evidence that shows that meat processing facilities are places where we're seeing huge spikes in COVID-19 infections because of the nature of the facilities, the proximity of the workers, the fact that they've been continuing to operate while the infection rates have been going up. And so I'm wondering what some of the legal issues are in the context of that industry in particular. We've seen the president taking steps to try to encourage or even force the industry to keep operating through the Defense Production Act. And so I'm wondering what kinds of legal and policy issues are coming up specifically in that industry.
Okay, yeah. One of the things I want to sort of start off by clarifying is that a lot of the news coverage of the Defense Production Act has been kind of mischaracterizing what the Defense Production Act does. It was originally designed in response to the Korean War to allow the president to require businesses to accept and prioritize contracts for materials deemed necessary for national defense. And so they're deeming meat as, I guess, necessary for national defense. There's some pushback on that. I have a colleague, Andrew Freeman, who's written an article about how, meat is not necessarily essential. There's many other foods around. But setting that aside, what the law does is it allows the president to designate these materials to prohibit it from hoarding and price gouging. So what it really does is it provides some kind of protection from antitrust suits for production under these circumstances, versus the broader range of liability waivers that were invoked by the president in signing that executive order, but not actually contained in the executive order or the Defense Production Act. So I want to say that it doesn't actually protect meat facilities from any kind of liability. However, a lot of states are raising, potential sort of potential statutory protections for meat packing facilities from state liability, sort of tort from state torts. And to that extent, there might end up being some kind of liability protection for these facilities.
Now, would that liability protection be again protection against lawsuits from the workers who are infected while working, or more broadly related to the products as well?
From what I've seen, it's mostly related to the workers, which is really quite terrible for the workers, right? In terms of whether they're able to sort of raise lawsuits for negligence in terms of protecting them from this. So what I've seen is it's mostly liability waivers for worker kind of lawsuits.
Yeah. What are some of the other protections that would be in place to protect workers against the kinds of exposures that they might face in this current situation?
Well, some smaller meat processors have adopted ways to actually protect their workers. And part of that is because their facilities are designed in ways that the workers can actually space themselves out versus having to work in sort of close quarters, the way that many of the sort of more industrial facilities are structured. So they've been spacing workers out, and they've also been timing shifts, right? So that there are fewer workers in there. Now, some of the, I think, larger meat processors could do that too, but I haven't seen enough flexibility in their chains to really allow for that. That's what some of the sort of smaller scale producers are doing. And they're also providing more PPEs to people too.
Okay. So another topic that I wanted to make sure we covered in our talk today relates to food safety, and it's my impression that our infrastructure for ensuring food safety is not necessarily very robust even in normal times, and I would imagine that especially under our current conditions there will be less initiative to enforce the normal inspection kinds of protocols and food safety measures that are in place. But I'm wondering how the COVID pandemic has affected food safety oversight and just what people who are purchasing food can expect in terms of the safety of their food.
Well, I want to split this up in terms of oversight because there's first the sort of actual, government oversight, which, as you mentioned, is not quite complete. And then there's actually the sort of private governance kind of oversight, because it turns out that whenever there's like some kind of major outbreak, for instance, in spinach or something, it's not just like one single brand of spinach that gets affected. Nobody wants spinach all of a sudden, right? And so they have some incentives built in for sort of private reasons to have that. So I'll talk about those in two separate parts. With respect to sort of governmental food safety inspections, the FDA has already issued something saying they're doing less testing because they don't want their inspectors exposed to stuff. The USDA, however, is claiming that they're maintaining the same degree of testing. And what that means in terms of consumers directing their health concerns, if they're worried about less government inspections, is you have to look at the jurisdictional split of these two agencies. The USDA is really directed towards meats and all of that other stuff, while the FDA manages processed foods, shelled eggs, raw produce, dairies, and stuff like that. And so, if you want to sort of say, okay, well, I'm worried about different government agencies doing different degrees of inspection, you have to look at what they cover.
Yeah.
The second part, right, is the private part of this, and they still have many sort of major food processors still have the sort of private incentive to protect both their branding and themselves from food safety lawsuits. So I think that part, while maybe getting lax, I think they're still aware of those food safety concerns.
Okay, thanks. There's so many things happening related to food right now, and one of the other issues that I think is really urgent to address is just overall access to food, because of the mass unemployment that's occurred due to the pandemic, and because so many people are losing access to their normal source of income. Obviously, that affects people's ability to buy essential products like food. We've seen huge expansions in some operations to try to provide food assistance, and I know a lot of state and local governments are looking at some of those issues. What are some of the issues going on right now in terms of access to food and ways that access to food might be limited or might be expanded through different kinds of initiatives?
So food access is limited partly by just, ability to shop for food and sort of risks of exposure coming from that. I know that there's a lot of grocery stores that are offering delivery kind of services, but the wait time can be really large to get access to those kind of things, and so there's a large wait list for that. There's actually some special concerns for those who are disabled and unable to sometimes access those apps and stuff like that. And the same thing too with folks who are living in relative food deserts where they don't have access to these sort of large-scale food distribution systems. That said, you also asked about what different layers of government are doing about this, and the USDA did announce a coronavirus food assistance program is what they're calling it, to use their funds to purchase like $3 billion in fresh vegetables and stuff like that, and distributing to different states. And so far, Maryland's disaster household distribution program has applied for some of that. Different states are doing that as well. But this is just one example of a way that a state is partnering with the federal government to provide additional access. And Maryland's program works by actually creating a digital mapping system that can be accessible to everyone to figure out where they can get these sort of food distribution supplies, and so that there is some kind of way to address the food desert issue that is available for many low-income communities.
Yeah, I know another issue that's come up in terms of access relates to access to food through the school system, and many children receive their meals through the schools, and since schools have been mostly suspended, certainly for in-person attendance for the rest of the year, that also might affect children's access to food.
Yeah, and many states, I don't know if all the states are doing pickups available still with the lunches that would have been otherwise distributed through schools. So that's one area where states can step up and still provide access to families whose kids need food.
Okay. So I want to go back big picture again and sort of think about what this experience and obviously we're still only at the early stages of this pandemic. It's going to continue to affect our lives substantially for the next couple of years. And how do you think the disruptions and the changes that have gone on will ultimately affect the food system? Are there additional either legal or policy initiatives that we should be thinking about now to not only keep the food system operating in the way that we want it to, but to sort of look ahead and address the kinds of challenges we might face in the future as we continue to adapt to this new reality that we're in?
I think that one thing that I hope this pandemic makes the industry realize is that the need for flexibility is quite great. That's something that people have talked about for years. For instance, after the Fukushima nuclear disaster, a lot of seafood supply chains were disrupted. And those were, and there's been a number of them as a result of tsunamis and things like that. And the industry has responded somewhat, but not in quite as robust a manner as I think many people in this sort of supply chain management world would have hoped. And I hope that that's one thing that at least for large-scale kind of food processors, they'll try to take into account. That said, I think that hopefully consumers will realize that sort of these small chain kind of smaller linked kind of supply chains, such as sort of direct sales and stuff like that, can actually help with navigating through situations like these. For example, a lot of farms that were selling foods directly to restaurants have now developed ways to ship directly to consumers, and maybe familiarity with that will help consumers realize that we don't need to have this kind of large linkage chain connection, and we can have these shorter supply chains that are often more adaptable than the long supply chains.
Oh, that would be. I think it's fascinating to see how people have been adapting to these circumstances, and obviously, a related issue is going to be just the fact that so many businesses, especially some of those smaller operations, whether they be small farms or restaurants or other food providers at different parts of that supply chain, whether they're able to survive economically throughout this time, and how many of them are still in place afterward, and we might have to rebuild some of that capacity as well, I would guess.
Yeah, we might have to, and I think that different Municipalities are planning for that. For instance, the Madison Food Policy Council, which advises the mayor on food policy issues, has been recommending that local food resources be prioritized and that we create some kind of infrastructure beforehand to try to sort of keep those industries alive and maybe sort of help promote them after the pandemic is over.
Okay, so we are almost out of time, and so I guess I just wanted to wrap up by asking you if there are any other thoughts, final recommendations, ideas, things that we should be looking at as we go forward.
I think one thing, and this is a much nerdier thing, but I think insurance issues are going to play out a lot, especially for restaurants, but also for many other kind of food processing kind of businesses in terms of whether or not it counts as a sort of business interruption and whether or not they can claim money from their insurance companies as a result of that. I think that the ability to obtain business interruption insurance money will be critical in terms of allowing these sort of small industries to survive.
Okay, well, thank you. I want to thank Steph again for being our guest today. She's a professor of law at the University of Wisconsin Law School, expert in food system policy and law and environmental law and administrative law and many other things. So you should check out her work. We'll post some of it online at our different links. All of these shows are archived at the Public Health Law Watch website, as well as being broadcast on the Week in Health Law podcast. So please visit both of those sites as well to find this recording and also all of our other broadcasts. We do these every week on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at noon. So tune in tomorrow for another one at noon. And also want to acknowledge that these COVID-19 law and policy briefings are produced by Faith Kalick and Bethany Saxon. We'll see you next time. Stay safe, wash your hands, stay home. Thank you.
Thank you.